Nostalgia is a powerful drug. I don't know who originally said that, but it's a quote that seems to be getting more and more true day by day. Maybe it's because I'm getting older, or maybe it's because we've had a bit of a regurgitation problem from a lot of major franchises in the past decade or so. I'm 23 this year, still in college, and more I find myself looking back, remembering things from my childhood with a brighter warmth than usual. Of course, I've always stood on the idea that one must interact with their nostalgia responsibly. As stated earlier, nostalgia is a drug like any other. Thus, it means at some point, you'll eventually have to go back and confront it. Was it as good as your past self remembered? Does it stand up today? Was it even good in the first place? These are all things I'd assume a lot of other people deal with when looking back on stuff that deeply affected them. Usually, I'm confronted with these three outcomes when I interact with art that I had attachment to when I was younger. Either it doesn't hold up anymore, it's about as good as I remember, and sometimes there's that rare third option, where something turns out much more complex and much better than I remembered it being. And this brings me to the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, one of the franchises that somehow finds a way to stand the test of time. The franchise that somehow I get excited with every reboot, reinvention, and iteration. Why is this? Well, I believe it comes down to one word: reinvention. It knows to change it up every couple of years and tries its best to not outstay its welcome. It evolves and shifts with every new age, and while sure, not every version is made equally, at least it doesn't try to feed you old stories while acting like there's something new. This isn't exactly a trait unique to only TMNT. There's many other franchises that do this as well, some of which I've probably already covered. To give some examples, Doctor Who, Final Fantasy, and Kamen Rider are all franchises that partake in this style of franchise structuring. Alright, Mr. YouTube Man. Enough with the philosophical rambling. What's this got to do with TMNT 1990? You're probably saying. Well, firstly, practice some patience. Let me do my preamble. And secondly, all these shifting franchises have an interesting point where it seems that they are a sort of point in time or a point of art that acts as a sort of vortex of influence for their respective series. Or to simplify it further, these franchises have what I would like to call a fulcrum point. For Final Fantasy, it's obviously FF7 in 1997. For Doctor Who, it's Tom Baker's time as the 4th Doctor and David Tennant's time as the 10th Doctor. And for TMNT, I'll easily say that it's the film released in 1990. Let's talk about one of my favorite films ever made. Let me tell you why Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles is a cinematic masterpiece. Close your eyes and imagine this with me. It's the late 80s. You're a guy who's gone from making DIY-style comics from your apartment with your close friend to having one of the biggest pop culture phenomena of all time. It's unprecedented. It just started off as something you made as a joke with your friend, and now it's Saturday morning cartoons, action figures, concerts, and so much money that you have no idea what to do with it half the time. And that was where Kevin Eastman and Peter Laird were at. They just made a comic to parody the darkness and edge of American comics in the 1980s. And they're probably behind one of the biggest properties since Star Wars. Kids were wearing their characters on their t-shirts, for crying out loud. Hell, Kevin bought a tank! That really happened, by the way. The 80s were a wild time. Now, as a writer and a creative myself, I would kill to have something with this extraordinary popularity. But for Eastman and Laird, they probably had a ton to deal with on their hands. The crazy part is, after all the success, movie studios doubted the likely success of a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles film. In retrospect, we could see that wasn't so bright, but maybe that was a good thing. Because of the doubt, less grubby producer hands were on the product, so the final film could probably feel raw and more real, and closer to what they actually intended to make. Interestingly, the first pitch for a TMNT movie actually came from Roger Corman. And if you don't know who that is, you should look into him. He's probably one of the most important figures in American cinema, also known as the King of the B-movies. And for the record, it's not like the B-movie with Jerry Seinfeld. Seriously, learn your history. Though his pitch wasn't exactly what they wanted. I mean, he basically pitched comedians Billy Crystal, Gallagher, Bobcat Goldthwait, and Sam Kinison as the Turtles, which would have been interesting, but luckily they didn't go through with it. Apparently it was also supposed to be rated R. I don't know what exactly he intended to do, but I'm feeling like it would have turned into something like Porky's or Meet the Feebles, which, yeah, maybe it's for the better that didn't happen. Instead, we got a version that was produced by Orange Sky Golden Harvest, which was actually a studio famous for bringing a lot of Bruce Lee and Jackie Chan's martial arts films to America. So, elements of this film were produced like a classic Hong Kong action film, which kind of makes sense, and makes it also ahead of the curve, because that's actually a style The Matrix would pull from with massive success way later in the same decade. Later into production, mostly after the writing and some pre-production, they'd bring in Limelight Productions with Steve Barron to direct the movie, which is an interesting pick because Steve Barron isn't really known for directing films, but instead he was one of the biggest names in music video directing. To give you some examples and some of his bigger hits from his lineup of music videos, he directed Take On Me by a-ha, Billie Jean by Michael Jackson, Africa by Toto. Like, seriously, if there is an iconic music video from the 80s and even 90s, Steve Barron probably directed it. It's very likely. So one big thing that Steve Barron did for this movie is he actually fought the studios to keep a lot of the grittier and darker elements to the story, which, thank you. This is an example of a movie that knows when to be dark and when to have fun, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Of course, another major factor in this movie's production was the Jim Henson Creature Shop. This is probably some of their best work ever. I mean, they nailed the turtles especially. Each one has a unique shape and color to where you don't even need to have their masks on to identify them. Fun fact, when they were filming the farmhouse scenes of this movie, it was actually near an airport in North Carolina. At the time, they used radio frequencies to control the animatronic heads. So whenever a plane would fly over, the turtles' faces would all get screwed up due to the gearing system inside of them. So Brian Henson, son of Jim Henson, second unit director of the film, and co-creator of the classic sci-fi franchise Farscape, decided that what if they put their radio signals onto a military channel? Now, this is very illegal, and he didn't know it was illegal until years later when he was filming the show Dinosaurs. And the military pretty much pulled up to the studio and went, "What are you doing on our military comms?" So, interesting bit of film trivia for you. I'll also mention that the process for making this movie was very chaotic, and there were multiple points where they had to scrounge around for funding, but somehow they pulled through and made a great movie. Now, with all that out of the way, I kind of want to get deeper into the sewers, if you will, and talk about this film's various strengths. So firstly, this film does something that I don't really think happens in film anymore, which is that it starts with more of an introduction to the atmosphere and setting of the story. I'm pretty sure the movie goes about 5 whole minutes without even showing us a full shot of the turtles, which by modern standards is showing a lot of restraint. Instead, we get a really well-shot segment of crime being committed across New York with April O'Neil reporting over it. It's an incredible piece of storytelling. You can also notice in the scene that all the crimes are coordinated to some extent, and we even get to see some Foot Clan ninjas, so it gives us a real grasp on what the focal issue and threat is for the film. And it clues us into maybe some possible themes and moments later in the movie. The best part of the Turtles introduction is that they're introduced doing ninja stealth, not exploding onto the scene like action heroes or Marvel movie characters. Instead, we get a scene of them covered in darkness, and we hear them only attack from the shadows. This movie at least sticks to the ninja part of the title. Of course, we immediately get the Turtles reveling in their victory afterwards. I know a complaint from some people that TMNT media doesn't really make the Turtles feel like teens, but this movie does a great job in making them feel their age. They joke, get a bit big-headed sometimes, and even argue with each other. It definitely makes the viewer recognize their close bond, but also make them feel like they're a real family that's a bit messy. Like most families are, really. This movie honestly is a great example of showing and not telling. I mean, I feel like a lot of cinematography in this movie is pretty slept on. One great scene is where they introduce the Shredder, well, technically the second time they introduce him. And you don't see him standing at first. No, instead you see this impossibly large shadow creeping over the shot, making him feel like this powerful, imposing villain that enforces his presence onto the film, if you will. There's also this great scene with Danny. Here he's caught in the struggle between the influence of Splinter's wisdom and Shredder's manipulation. The interesting detail here is that when he's rolling back and forth, he's in the light when Splinter is speaking and in the shadow when Shredder is speaking. Maybe I'm reading too much into that, but my film visual metaphor part of my brain couldn't help but pick up on that detail. They also do this visual trick I love in flashbacks. When characters are talking about the past or doing a flashback, the entire background dims or goes black, except for the characters speaking. They also do this thing I noticed, and maybe I'm looking too much into it, but characters that are meant to be a representation of the past or characters in the past seem to be shot with an older camera, thus making them look more grainy and older in comparison to things shot on the more recent camera of the time. Again, I don't know if that was intentional or not, but it seems like a very intentional choice by Steve Barron. Of course, this movie also succeeds at really great and subtle moments of characterization. One example is how snarky they made April in this movie. Like, they could have made her a generic female lead to be saved by the Turtles, but instead they gave her a personality, something similar to Lois Lane, but with a little bit more sass. And to explain what I mean by the Lois Lane comparison, when Lois Lane is written well and correctly, she's a character trying to drag the truth out of a situation by any means possible. She's the perfect journalist because she really cares about getting the word of the people, and sometimes that gets her into sticky situations. There's another great moment where they give Casey Jones claustrophobia. They didn't need to add that in, but it's a detail to make the characters feel just a little bit more real, a little bit more alive, if you will. Of course, now that I'm talking about character writing, I have to talk about one of my favorite scenes in all of film, probably some of my favorite writing in all of film, maybe all of media, and it's this scene right here.
Nice night.
Mm-hmm. Pizza dude's got 30 seconds.
Mm-hmm. Hey, Mikey, did you ever think about what Splinter said tonight? I mean, about what it would be like. You know, not having him.
Time's up. $3 off.
Now, in context, you'd think that's just a scene for comedy's sake. You know, Mikey's a bit of an airhead. And it is a funny scene, but if you notice later on in the film, during the scene where they're interacting with Splinter in the fire, he's the one crying. He's the one that's having the most extreme reaction to the scenario. And all the puzzle pieces click together in your head. You realize that Mikey wasn't being airheaded. He was actively shutting down the conversation because he didn't want to confront the idea. And it makes sense. He's the youngest of the turtles, so he'd be the one who has the most room to grow, but also the one who's probably the most afraid of losing his dad. And there's all sorts of like little dialogue in this movie that's great. Just little nuggets of character throughout the movie, like this example.
I only keep it open part-time, mostly for my dad. He loved junk. I don't know, I guess it's kind of dumb to lose money on a business just because you miss your father.
No, it isn't.
See, it's just nice to see a movie where the characters aren't afraid to be sentimental. Plus, these little moments of sincerity allow the audience to feel more attached to the characters. The musical score of this movie is also great. It's a mix of synth, rock, with light elements of jazz and orchestra, but it gives it the sort of oddly timeless, but also of its time appeal. It's like listening to like a Beatles album from their later era or something. Sure, it's of its time, but the way it's constructed and the emotions they're getting at are pretty timeless within themselves. And I mean, the groove that they have for the Turtles theme alone is just fun. And the music when they play for the emotional and mystical feeling scenes is just... I don't even know how to describe it, but it feels like that emotion you feel when you're talking to your parents on a really hard storm under candlelight. I don't know, it's just a really great emotion they put into that piece. Also, a lot of the tracks carry an overall leitmotif that comes from the Turtles theme or the Shredders theme. So it definitely has a strong musical identity and also quick to identify what emotion you're meant to be feeling. I could also talk about the great animatronic work from Jim Henson's Creature Shop, but I think that's the most apparent quality of the film. I'll talk about it briefly anyway though. Henson knocked it out of the park with this. Again, revolutionizing practical effects yet again. It's crazy to think that the studio was afraid of working with him because Labyrinth and The Dark Crystal flopped at the time, both of which are now considered cult classics or even just classics in their own respects. But the animatronic work here was working on all cylinders right here. Big respect to the suit actors for working in such heavy and stressful suits. I'm also going to say here that the voice work is just phenomenal. A lot of the movie had to be ADR'd in post due to the conditions of filming. To explain for people who may not know, ADR, which is an acronym for Automated Dialogue Replacement, is when an actor is taken into a voice acting booth later to dub over their performance because it might have not been recorded with the best recording the first time around. And trust me, this happens a lot more than you think. It still happens today. It's also a pretty frequent occurrence when you have a physical actor giving their physical performance, but then also have a separate actor come in and dub over their performance to get a different voice. And this isn't just done for like dubbing a foreign film, this is done for American and like English speaking films as well. A recent example of this is the Twisted Metal series on Peacock. The physical performance was done by the one and only Samoa Joe, who by the way is a great wrestler, he's very slept on. And the voice performance is done by Will Arnett, who you'd probably know from the Lego Movie, BoJack Horseman, Arrested Development, and a whole bunch of other things. Getting back on track though, the voice work is incredible. All the voice actors for the turtle give their performance so much life and personality. Also, fun fact, the voice actor for Raphael was also the suit actor for him. They all do a great job. Their dialogue has just a rhythm and has a bit of punch to it with the delivery. Though obviously the most famous actor doing voices here is Corey Feldman. He's not exactly popular today, but he was huge in the 80s. Probably the biggest child actor of that time. I mean, he was in Gremlins, The Goonies, The Lost Boys, and just a ton of iconic films from that time. And the Turtles all have great chemistry, as I already said. It makes me wonder if they recorded separately or together. So, yeah, that's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. It's a movie I grew up with and watched a lot as a kid. Sure, it didn't come out when I was born. I was a 2000s baby. But it was a film that my mom shared with me from her childhood, and because of that, it became a part of mine. It's unironically one of my favorite movies of all time. Sure, maybe it's not as experimental as Pulp Fiction or as beloved as Casablanca, but I have a deep love for this movie. I'm just glad that on rewatch it was actually greater than I remembered it being. In a way, it sort of justified my love for the Turtles as a kid, as well as my current love for them. This movie honestly inspired me to create things when I was younger, because on paper, a movie called Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles sounds like it'd be cheap and terrible and stupid. But this movie showed me that with enough care, love, and attention, any idea can be made into a great piece of art. With all that being said, I'll catch you next time.